Hey guys, I'm Ted. Welcome back to our lecture series. And for this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion on Theodore Roosevelt and progressivism. In our last lecture, we capped things off with Roosevelt's meteoric rise after the meteoric political rise after the Spanish War, how he rode his political and social clout into becoming the governor of the state of New York, and from being governor of the state of New York, he rode that to being the vice presidential running mate for William McKinley. And after McKinley's unfortunate assassination, untimely assassination, he became president of the United States at such a young age, in his early 40s. Roosevelt then embarked on nothing short of a remarkable reinvigoration of the office of president. He was really the first man since Lincoln to become a well-known, well-rounded, well-respected figure within national politics, especially within the presidency, within the Oval Office itself. Now Roosevelt, one of the things that he did as president was to really become the first president to treat the unions with any sort of compassion. None of his predecessors, from really Hayes on down to McKinley, none of them had treated the unions with any sort of compassion. They had always sided with business and always came down to repress the unions. Roosevelt rationalized that, like corporations, trade unions could be good or they could be bad. He made this distinction between good and bad unions the same way he made a distinction between good and bad trust. In 1902, he did what none of his predecessors had ever done. He intervened in a labor dispute, in a strike, on behalf of striking coal miners in Pennsylvania. He invited both sides to the White House to a summit to hammer out the details, the differences, and this was a novel idea at the time. The melting pot, the mine owners, at the meeting, the mine owners refused to hear any of the opposing arguments of his practices and conduct. So President Roosevelt actually threatened military intervention on behalf of the miners, and this led the mine owner to reconsider his stance and to accept arbitration, which included a bump in pay for the workers and no formal acknowledgement of the union by the mining company. Again, this is a square deal. This is everybody getting something in this bargain. So this was one of the ways in which Roosevelt dealt with unions. Now Roosevelt was also motivated to accept moderate unions out of his opposition to socialism. Roosevelt hated socialism, and he feared that the government was too uncompromising with moderate unions, and if the government continued to be uncompromising with moderate unions, that the government would send them into the arms of the socialists. So this was sort of a preemptive move on Roosevelt's part to ensure that the socialists didn't find ready recruits, that socialism didn't spread. Now, in 1908, Roosevelt was reelected to office. In 1904, Roosevelt was reelected to office. Sorry about that. And announced that he would not seek re-election in 1908. He announced it almost immediately. Now, this was a miscalculation on his part. It made him a lame duck president and allowed his opponents to more vigorously resist his efforts at reform. After his presidency, he went on an African safari and shot a number of big game animals. Now, his successor, William Howard Taft, was handpicked and groomed for Roosevelt himself. Taft was a progressive Republican, but not as forceful as Roosevelt, or as amenable with corporations or the press. Taft was a lawyer, and he was a stickler for the rule of law. And Taft didn't even really want the presidency. He accepted the honor, but he really wanted to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Everybody knew that's what he really wanted to do. He wanted that big job and had the lawyer. You can sort of see that appeal to Taft. Now, Roosevelt really came to regret his decision, and by 1912 he had made up his mind. Excuse me. By 1912, Roosevelt had made up his mind to challenge Taft for the presidency. He tried to reclaim the Republican Party nomination, but the party. Excuse me again. In 1912, the Republican Party leadership rebuffed his attempts to sort of squeeze back into the office of presidency. They were unwilling to abandon an incumbent president who was still fairly popular. Undeterred, Roosevelt decided to run for office as an independent or third-party candidate. He called this party the Bull Moose Party and came up with the party name after an assassination attempt had failed. He was shot, but not seriously wounded. He finished his speech and then went out to seek medical treatment. In his opening remarks to the crowd after being shot, Roosevelt said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." So that's where the name Bull Moose comes from. Roosevelt never had the bullet removed, and he carried it with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't very serious. He had, the bullet had largely been blocked by his steel glasses case. So there wasn't a great deal of worry or threat to Roosevelt's personal security, to his survival. The election of 1912 was a watershed moment for the United States. The big issue was once again trust, and Roosevelt's plan was what he called new nationalism, which called for acceptance of large-scale business while allowing for more government oversight. Now, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, called for what he termed new freedom, which entailed a rolling back of a corporation to allow for increased competition. Now, the Socialist Party under Eugene Debs was also running in this election. There were 4 candidates. Eugene Debs with the Socialists, Theodore Roosevelt with the Bull Moose Party, Woodrow Wilson with the Democrats, and of course William Howard Taft, the incumbent president, running had the Republican candidate. Now, Debs claimed nearly 1 million votes. He claimed 900,000 votes, and this really surprised the major parties, who now came to be convinced that they would have to adopt at least some of the Socialist Party platforms in the future, or they would be replaced. Had Debs and the party were climbing. They began to formulate the same plans that they have formulated and put in place against the Populist Party to sort of cut them off before they became a major rival. There were far more members of the working class. They realized now than there were members of any other class. And Woodrow Wilson won the election, and he was only the second Democrat to become president after the 1860 election. For nearly 50 years, the Republican Party held the presidency. Their hold was broken up only by Grover Cleveland's 2 non-consecutive terms. Now, Woodrow Wilson was an unabashed racist who wholeheartedly supported and adhered to Dixiecrat, or the Southern Democrat, the Democrats of the Redeemed States, to their ideology. He had been a political science professor and later president of Princeton University before becoming a progressive reformer governor of New Jersey. While still advocating racist policies as a progressive reformer in New Jersey. Now, Wilson won the election in 1912, much like how Lincoln won the election of 1860, a split in the dominant party's vote. But Wilson proved to be successful at first by putting in place all of the programs that Theodore Roosevelt had said he would do if he was elected. Wilson largely dropped the New Freedom platform and embraced the New Nationalism platform. He created the Federal Reserve, had the Banking Regulatory Agency, the Federal Trade Commission, that began to scrutinize the corporations and their transgressions, but not forcing them to break up. It was also under Wilson that 2 of the populist most attractive and long-lived initiatives were realized. the direct election of senators, and a direct income tax. Um, in the United States, it is said that modern liberal ideology is traced back to the progressive movement. Now, the progressive movement really came to dominate both parties in national politics before the 1920s. And Roosevelt and Wilson, they were both openly championed. They both openly championed the progressive ideas. Now, the progressives were not liberals. They held many ideas that modern liberals would find repulsive. But there are shared links between modern liberals and the progressives, but not to any degree to where one can be said to have descended from the other. Part of the reason for this is that the meaning and uses of the word liberal and conservative have changed dramatically over the past century, doing so more than once. Part of the problem also is that there's a tendency to misidentify with the progressives, misidentify with the progressives, misidentify who the progressives were and what they really stood for. We will continue to look into the progressive movement, and in our next lecture, we're actually going to analyze the progressives and their movement. We let me see. Now, the confusion over the progressives is justly understandable. It was never a unified movement. It was a movement comprised of many different groups with many different roles, and this reflected the legislative acts and constitutional amendments that were passed during this time, during the progressive era. The constitutional amendments, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, which established the income tax, the direct election of senators, prohibition, and of course women's suffrage, all came into being. The amendments alone lead one to ask, what possibly could this group have in common. The same conclusion can be drawn when examining major pieces of congressional legislation, and the major pieces of legislation range from the establishment of the first income tax. This was overturned by a Supreme Court decision that we already discussed in a previous lecture, but it also contained bills to regulate the railroads, antitrust legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Federal Reserve creation, and of course a tax on civil liberties and immigration, along with racial hygienic laws. Again, it leads one to ask, what in the world could these people have in common? And really, the progressive era and the progressives themselves would also see the emergence of professional organizations with enforced professional standards and the beginning of social work as we know it today. Birth control, as we know it today, can even be traced back to this era, with Margaret Sanger really beginning her career during this time. A further deterioration of the condition of African Americans can be traced back to the time, particularly after the election and during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. The politicizing of churches, particularly with the social gospel, can be traced back to this time. And of course, eugenics, the eugenic movement, forced sterilization, they all stem from this era. Very different and seemingly incompatible forces. All of those movements, all of those things came together under the umbrella of progressivism. Very incompatible forces. Now, the progressive movement did help to elect two of the 20th century's most well-known presidents, Roosevelt and Wilson. Even though they came from different parties, these two actually they actually ran against each other, as we just discussed in 1912, on near opposing progressive platforms. They had wildly different personalities and really came to intensely dislike each other. But again, they both identified with progressivism, and they both identified as progressives. So we're still at a loss right now to accurately describe what the progressives were and who they were. Now, really, we sort of add to the confusion before we actually solve anything. This part right here, that actually a lead up to my final part of the lecture, my final lecture on progressivism. But the progressive era also embraced figures such as John Dewey, the father of modern education, Jane Addams, the mother of modern social work, General Leonard Wood, who increased efficiency by introducing progressive reforms in the United States Army. General Wood is also known for trying to instill Army values on the civilian population. Jurists such as Oliver Wendell Holmes, Louis Brandeis, expose journalists like Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Stephens, novelists like Theodore Dreiser, Upton Sinclair, imperialists like Theodore Roosevelt, and anti-imperialists like Senator Robert La Follette. Very powerful senator, progressive Republican senator. Now, the progressive agenda also contained many elements of the 1982 populist platform, though most of the movement leaders had been keen and documented anti-populist during the populist movement. Big business leaders, as I noted, were a part of the progressive movement, though the movement called for increased business regulations. And again, the business leaders will come to identify and come to champion these because it served to stifle competition. Newcomers couldn't really compete against established businesses because established businessmen could always conform more easily to these new regulations than these newcomers could. So business leaders fit into it. Immigrants supported it, even though the movement called for immigration regulations. African Americans supported the progressives, even though the progressives contained many racist leaders and called for a lot of racial hygienic laws. Women supported it, even though women's rights wasn't really supported by many of the populist leaders. And many of the populist leaders openly stated they wanted to protect women on the grounds of their supposed inferiority. And given the various and the varying and really at odds groups and ideologies, it is best to look at this era as a searching or a quest for order in the wake of the earth-shattering ramification and consequences of industrialization on the United States. We're still assessing the progressive movement, but we're going to break here and we're going to come back with our closing lecture on the progressive movement. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you think so far about the progressive movement. Many people, many of my students in my class are just like, well, what were they? Who were they? They don't sound like they have anything in common. Well, and we will resolve the issue of who they were in our next lecture. But hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you think about the progressive so far, and I will see you guys for our next lecture.